A Dakota trapper found a dying widow and her twins buried in a blizzard that should have killed them all. He saved their lives, but the truth she was hiding would turn his quiet frontier existence into a deadly game of survival where the past never stays buried. And some secrets are worth killing for. Dakota Territory, February 1881. The blizzard had been raging for 4 days straight, turning the vast prairie into a white hell where nothing could survive. Wind howled across the frozen grasslands like the screams of 1,000 demons, driving snow so thick that a man couldn't see his own hand stretched in front of his face. This was the kind of storm that killed everything it touched: cattle, horses, and especially people foolish enough to be caught in the open when winter showed its teeth.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Samuel Rivers had seen storms before in his 32 years on the frontier, but nothing like this. The wind was so fierce it threatened to tear the roof off his cabin, and the snow piled so high against his door that he'd had to dig himself out 3 times just to check on his horses. This was the kind of weather that made even the Lakota stay close to their fires and wait for the spirits to finish their war in the sky. Sam was a trapper by trade and a loner by choice, though choice might be too generous a word. Life had a way of making decisions for a man, especially out here where the nearest neighbor was 20 miles away, and the closest thing to civilization was Fort Dakota, a rough military outpost another 40 miles beyond that. He'd chosen this. Isolation after the war, after Gettysburg and Antietam had shown him what men could do to each other when they put their minds to it. The wilderness was honest in its brutality. It would kill you quick and clean, not slowly and with malice. His cabin sat in a valley between 2 low hills, sheltered from the worst of the prairie winds, but still exposed enough that he could see trouble coming from miles away. It was built of thick pine logs he'd cut himself, chinked with mud and grass, with a stone chimney that drew clean and a roof that had weathered 5 Dakota winters without complaint. The walls were lined with beaver pelts, fox furs, and wolf hides, the fruits of his solitary labor that would eventually make their way to trading posts, and from there to the fine ladies of Chicago and New York who never thought about the men who died to keep them warm. Sam hadn't always been a hermit. Before the war, he'd been Samuel Rivers of the Pennsylvania 83rd Infantry, a young man who believed in causes and country and the righteousness of fighting for what was right. He'd marched off to war with a heart full of idealism and a head full of romantic notions about honor and glory. The reality of war had beaten those notions out of him with the efficiency of a sledgehammer. At Gettysburg, he'd watched his best friend die with his guts spilled across the Pennsylvania dirt, calling for his mother with his last breath. At Antietam, he'd bayoneted a Confederate boy who couldn't have been more than 16, looked into his dying eyes, and seen his own younger brother staring back at him. When the war ended, Sam had collected his mustering out pay and headed west, as far from civilization and its wars as he could get. The Dakota Territory offered what he was looking for: vast emptiness, where a man could disappear into the landscape and forget that the world existed beyond the horizon. For 7 years, he'd lived this way, checking his trap lines, hunting for meat, trading his furs at Fort Dakota twice a year, and avoiding human contact whenever possible. It was a simple life, clean in its isolation, free from the complications that came with caring about other people. But loneliness was a hungry beast that fed on itself, growing stronger with each passing season. There were nights when Sam would find himself talking to his horses just to hear a voice, even if it was his own. Nights when the silence pressed against his eardrums like a physical weight, and the emptiness of his cabin felt like a tomb. He'd learned to live with it, the way a man learned to live with an old wound that ached in bad weather, but it was always there, gnawing at the edges of his contentment. This particular blizzard had blown in from the northwest with a vengeance that surprised even Sam, who'd thought he'd seen everything the Dakota weather could throw at him. The temperature had dropped 30 degrees in 2 hours, and the wind had picked up to a constant roar that made conversation impossible even inside his thick-walled cabin. Snow didn't fall so much as attack, driven horizontal by gusts that could knock a man flat. Sam had spent the first 3 days of the storm huddled by his fire, venturing out only to check on his horses and bring in more firewood from the pile he'd stacked against the north wall of his cabin. His 2 horses, a sturdy bay mare named Copper and an aging gelding called Moses, were secure in the lean-to he'd built against the cabin, but he worried about them constantly. Horses were smart enough to know when weather was trying to kill them, and both animals had been restless and nervous since the storm began. On the 4th day, when the wind finally began to die and the snow thinned enough that he could see the outline of the hills around his valley, Sam knew he had to venture out. His trap lines were probably destroyed, but they represented his livelihood, and he needed to assess the damage. More importantly, he was running low on fresh meat, and the storm would have driven game animals to seek shelter in predictable places. He dressed in Layer's wool union suit, flannel shirt, leather vest, and his heavy buffalo coat that hung past his knees. The coat had cost him a month's worth of furs, but it was worth every pelt for weather like this. Wool socks inside waterproof boots, leather gloves inside fur mittens, and a hat that covered everything but his eyes. He strapped on his snowshoes, checked his rifle, and stepped out into a world that had been completely transformed. The familiar landscape of his valley had disappeared under 4 feet of snow, with drifts piled twice that high against the trees and hills. The creek that normally babbled through the center of the valley was silent under its blanket of ice and snow. Trees that he'd known for years looked like white phantoms, their branches bent and broken under the weight of accumulated snow. It was beautiful in a harsh, alien way, but also deeply unsettling. This was his home, his sanctuary, and the storm had made it unrecognizable. Sam worked his way carefully along what he thought was his main trap line, following barely visible landmarks and trusting his memory to guide him through the transformed landscape. Most of the traps were buried under snow that would take hours to dig out, and he was already calculating how many days it would take to reset his entire operation when he heard something that stopped him cold. A voice, thin and desperate, carried on the wind like an echo from another world. At first, Sam thought it might be the wind itself, playing tricks with his ears the way isolation could play tricks with a man's mind. But then it came again, clearer this time, and unmistakably human, the cry of a child, calling for help. Sam left his trap line and followed the sound, struggling through snow that came up to his thighs in some places, deeper where it had drifted against the trees. The crying grew stronger as he approached a stand of cottonwoods about a quarter mile from his usual route, and soon he could make out words. "Mama, Mama, please wake up." What Sam found when he reached those trees would change his life forever. A wagon, or what was left of one, lay on its side in a massive snowdrift that had built up against the largest cottonwood. The canvas cover was shredded, hanging in frozen tatters from broken wooden ribs. 2 horses lay dead in their traces, their bodies already stiff with cold, and partially buried by the drifting snow. But it wasn't the destroyed wagon or the dead horses that made Sam's heart pound. It was the 3 figures huddled together in what had once been the wagon bed, now tilted at a crazy angle and half filled with snow. A woman, maybe 30 years old, lay unconscious with 2 children pressed against her sides for warmth. She was wearing a dress that had once been fine blue wool, but was now torn and stained with blood and dirt. Over it was a fur-lined cloak that must have cost more than Sam made in 6 months of trapping. Her dark hair was matted with ice, and her lips were blue with cold, but her chest still rose and fell with the shallow breathing of someone clinging to life by the thinnest of threads.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
The children couldn't have been more than 10 years old. A boy and a girl who looked so much alike. They had to be twins. The boy was conscious, his eyes wide with terror and desperate hope when he saw Sam approaching through the snow. The girl was unconscious, curled against her mother's side like a small animal seeking the last warmth from a dying fire. "Please," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Please help us. Mama won't wake up and Hannah's so cold. I tried to keep them warm, but I'm not strong enough." Sam didn't waste time with questions. In 7 years of frontier living, he'd learned that you could think a situation to death while people died waiting for your decision. He dropped his rifle and pack and waded into the snow-filled wagon bed, his hands already working to assess the situation, even as his mind raced through the logistics of what he was facing. The woman, unconscious but breathing, pulse weak but steady. Blood had frozen in her dark hair where she'd taken a blow to the head, probably when the wagon overturned. Her skin was cold as marble, but not yet the waxy coldness that meant death was winning. She was fighting somewhere deep inside, and that gave him hope. The boy was in better shape, protected by his mother's body and what remained of heavy blankets. He could talk and move, though his lips were blue and his hands shook with more than just cold. The girl was unconscious but still breathing, her small body racked with shivers that told Sam her internal fires were still burning, barely. "What's your name, son?" Sam asked as he began bundling the family in his own blankets and spare furs. "Jacob," the boy said through chattering teeth. "Jacob Morgan. This is my sister Hannah, and my mama is Abby. We were trying to get to Fort Dakota, but the horses got scared in the storm and ran off the trail." The wagon turned over, and then the snow just kept coming. Sam nodded, but something didn't sit right about the story. Fort Dakota was 40 miles northeast of here, but this wagon had been traveling northwest when it wrecked, deeper into the wilderness and away from any settlement. Either the family had been hopelessly lost in the storm, or they'd been running from something rather than running to safety. But those questions could wait. Right now, 3 people were dying in front of him. Sam worked with the desperate efficiency of a man who understood that he had maybe an hour before the cold finished. What the storm had started. He fashioned a crude travois from broken wagon pieces and salvaged harness leather, creating a sled that could carry the unconscious woman and girl back to his cabin. Every minute he spent rigging the contraption was a minute these people got colder, but trying to carry them through deep snow without proper equipment would kill them all. "Jacob, I need you to be brave for me," Sam said as he secured the woman and girl to the travois. "We're going to my cabin, but it's going to be a hard trip. You hold tight to my belt and don't let go, no matter what happens. Can you do that?" The boy nodded, his young face set with a determination that reminded Sam of soldiers he'd known in the war, men who'd found courage they didn't know they had when everything depended on it. The journey back to Sam's cabin became a nightmare of grinding labor and desperate determination. The travois kept getting stuck in deep drifts, forcing Sam to dig it out while trying to keep the unconscious woman and girl from sliding off into the snow. Twice he had to carry Hannah while Jacob helped pull his mother through snow that came up to the boy's chest. The wind picked up again, driving fresh snow into their faces and making it almost impossible to see where they were going. But somehow, with a stubbornness born of desperation and frontier toughness, they made it. Sam's cabin appeared through the swirling snow like a vision of salvation, its windows glowing with the warm light of the fire he'd banked before leaving. He got the door open and dragged his unexpected guests inside, already stripping off their wet clothes and wrapping them in every blanket and fur he owned. The next hour was a blur of activity as Sam fought to bring 3 people back from the edge of death. He built up the fire until the cabin was warm enough to fog the windows, set water to boiling for warm baths to slowly raise their body temperature, and forced warm broth between blue lips whenever one of them was conscious enough to swallow. Gradually his efforts began to pay off. The woman's breathing grew stronger and more regular as she warmed up. Hannah woke up crying for her mama, which Sam took as a good sign. Jacob's color improved, and he was able to drink hot tea and eat a little bread. It was only after he'd gotten them all stable and comfortable that Sam really looked at what he'd brought into his isolated world. The woman's dress, even torn and stained, was made of fabric finer than anything he'd seen outside of St. Louis or Chicago. Her hands, though, cut and cold, were soft and uncalloused, the hands of someone who'd never done manual labor. The children's clothes were equally fine, made of good wool and well-tailored. When Sam examined their few possessions that had survived the wagon wreck, he found things that raised more questions than they answered. A small leather satchel contained more money than most frontier families saw in a year: gold coins and crisp banknotes that added up to at least $500. There was also a bundle of papers wrapped in oilcloth, legal documents of some kind with official seals and signatures that Sam didn't examine too closely out of respect for their privacy. Most puzzling of all was a small silver locket that had been sewn into the lining of the woman's cloak, hidden so carefully that Sam almost missed it. Inside was a photograph of a distinguished-looking man in an expensive suit, and on the back was engraved, "To my beloved Margaret, with all my love, Charles." But Jacob had said his mother's name was Abby, not Margaret, and he'd made no mention of a father. Sam put the locket away without saying anything to the children. Everyone on the frontier had secrets, and most of them were none of his business. What mattered now was keeping this family alive and figuring out what to do with them once the storm passed. As night fell, and the wind continued to howl around his cabin, Sam sat by the fire keeping watch over his unexpected guests. The woman, Abby, or Margaret or whatever her real name was, remained unconscious, but seemed to be getting stronger. Her color was better, and she no longer felt cold to the touch. The children slept fitfully, Jacob murmuring restlessly while Hannah clung to her mother's hand even in sleep. It was during the long hours of that first night that Sam began to piece together clues that suggested this family's problems went far beyond getting lost in a blizzard. The woman talked in her sleep, fragmented words and phrases that painted a picture of fear and desperation. "They can't find us," she whispered once, clear as day. "Have to keep running. Protect the children." Jacob, too, revealed things in his sleep that he hadn't said while awake. Sam heard him whisper, "Papa," in a voice full of longing and fear, and once he cried out, "Don't hurt Mama," as if reliving some terrible memory. Sam found himself studying the legal documents he'd found in their belongings, though he told himself it was none of his business. They appeared to be property deeds and bank records, but the names were confusing. Some made out to Margaret Whitmore, others to Abigail Morgan. There were also what looked like marriage certificates and birth records, but again, the names didn't match what Jacob had told him. Whatever had driven this family out into a Dakota blizzard, Sam was becoming convinced it wasn't just bad weather or poor navigation. Someone was running from something, and that something was dangerous enough to risk death in a winter storm, rather than face it. As the storm finally began to exhaust itself outside his cabin, Sam Rivers found himself in a situation he'd never expected. For 7 years, he'd lived alone in this valley, avoiding human contact and the complications that came with caring about other people. Now he had 3 strangers under his roof, and despite his best efforts to remain detached, he was already beginning to care what happened to them. Jacob was a brave, intelligent boy who'd tried to keep his mother and sister alive through 4 days of hell. Hannah was a sweet, quiet girl who reminded Sam painfully of his own sister, killed in a carriage accident when he was Jacob's age. And the woman, Abby or Margaret, was clearly someone who'd lived a life of privilege, but had found the strength to protect her children when everything went wrong. But Sam's instincts, sharpened by years of war and wilderness survival, told him that trouble was coming. Whatever this family was running from hadn't been buried by the blizzard. It was still out there, patient and relentless, waiting for the storm to pass so it could continue its pursuit. As he sat by the fire that night, listening to the wind gradually die away outside his cabin, Sam Rivers made a decision that would change his life forever. He'd saved these 3 people from the storm, and now he was going to protect them from whatever human predator was hunting them. He didn't know what it would cost him, or what dangers he was inviting into his peaceful existence, but he knew. He couldn't do anything else. Outside, the last of the storm winds whispered through the cottonwoods, carrying secrets and lies across the frozen prairie. Inside, 3 strangers slept by his fire, and Sam Rivers prepared for a fight he didn't understand against an enemy he'd never seen. The blizzard was over, but the real storm was just beginning. Dawn broke clear and bitter cold over the Dakota territory, painting the snow-covered valley in shades of gold and pink that would have been beautiful if Sam Rivers hadn't been so focused on the 3 lives depending on him. The storm had finally exhausted itself during the night, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt almost sacred. But Sam knew that silence was deceptive in country like this. Calm weather often meant that something worse was coming. Abigail Morgan had awakened just before sunrise, her eyes fluttering open to stare at the rough-hewn ceiling beams of Sam's cabin with the confused look of someone trying to remember where they were and how they'd gotten there. Sam had been dozing in his chair by the fire, but he came fully awake the moment he heard her stirring. "Easy," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. "You're safe. You're in my cabin." Abby tried to sit up, winced at the pain in her head, and immediately looked around for her children. Jacob and Hannah were still sleeping on a pallet of furs near the fire, their faces peaceful in the morning light. Only when she saw them breathing steadily did some of the tension leave her shoulders. "How long?" she asked, her voice hoarse from cold and exhaustion. "Found you yesterday afternoon. You've been unconscious for about 18 hours. Sam poured warm water from the kettle into a tin cup and brought it to her. "Drink this slowly. Your body's been through hell." Abby accepted the cup with hands that trembled slightly, though whether from weakness or something else, Sam couldn't tell. She was a beautiful woman. He realized now that he could see her properly dark hair that would probably shine like silk when it was clean, intelligent brown eyes, and delicate features that spoke of good breeding and a life of privilege. But there was something haunted in those eyes, a wariness that went deeper than just surviving a blizzard. "Thank you," she said after taking a sip of the warm water. "You saved our lives. I don't know how to repay you. No need for repayment. Anyone would have done the same." Abby looked at him with an expression that suggested she didn't believe that was true. Not everyone would risk their own life for strangers, especially not strangers who ... She trailed off, as if she'd been about to say something she shouldn't. Sam studied her face, noting the way she'd caught herself. "Strangers who what? Nothing. I'm still confused from the accident." But her eyes said she was lying, and they both knew it. Jacob woke up shortly after his mother, and the reunion between them was tearful and joyful. Hannah followed a few minutes later, shy and clinging to her mother, but clearly much stronger than she'd been the night before. Sam cooked them a breakfast of eggs, bacon, and biscuits, the best meal he could manage with his limited supplies, and watched as color returned to their faces and some of the haunted look faded from their eyes. It was while they were eating that Sam began to notice the inconsistencies in their stories. Jacob, chattering with the natural resilience of childhood, mentioned details that didn't quite match what he'd said the day before. "Are we going to see Uncle Charles now?" Hannah asked her mother at one point, and Sam saw Abby go rigid. "No, sweetheart. Uncle Charles is far away. We're going somewhere else now." "But I thought you said we were going to his big house with all the horses," Jacob said, confused. "The one with the white fence around it." "Plans changed," Abby said, firmly, in a tone that suggested the subject was closed. But Sam noticed how her hands clenched in her lap and how she avoided looking at him when she said it. Later, when the children were playing with some carved wooden animals Sam had whittled during long winter evenings, he decided to probe a little. More directly, "Fort Dakota's a rough place," he said casually. "Not really somewhere you'd want to take children, especially in winter. What was waiting for you there that was so important?" Abby was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "My husband died 6 months ago," she finally said. "We were living in Chicago, but after he passed, I couldn't afford to stay. I heard there were opportunities in the Dakota Territory, homestead land available for women with children." It was a plausible story, the kind Sam had heard dozens of times from other settlers. But something about the way she told it felt rehearsed, like she'd practiced it in front of a mirror. And it still didn't explain why they'd been traveling northwest when Fort Dakota was to the northeast. "Chicago's a long way from here," Sam said. "Must have been a hard journey, especially in winter. We took the train as far as we could then. Bought a wagon in Yankton. I thought we could make it before the worst of the winter weather hit." Abby's voice was steady, but Sam noticed she was gripping her coffee cup so tightly her knuckles were white. While Abby rested and the children played, Sam took the opportunity to examine more carefully the belongings he'd salvaged from their wagon. The legal documents he'd found were even more confusing in daylight than they'd been by firelight. There were indeed property deeds, but they were for land in Kansas, not Dakota Territory. The bank records showed accounts in both Chicago and St. Louis, with substantial sums of money, far more than a widow fleeing poverty would possess. Most puzzling were the marriage certificates. One was for Margaret Whitmore and Charles Ashford, dated 3 years earlier. Another was for Abigail Morgan and Thomas Morgan, dated 5 years ago. Sam was no lawyer, but it seemed to him that a woman couldn't be married to 2 different men at the same time, at least not legally. The photograph in the locket showed the same distinguished-looking man as before, but now Sam noticed details he'd missed in his haste to save lives. The man's clothing was expensive, his posture that of someone accustomed to wealth and authority. Behind him in the photograph was part of a large house with white columns, the kind of mansion that spoke of serious money and social position. Sam was beginning to suspect that Abby Morgan wasn't a poor widow seeking a new start in the territories. She was someone running from a life of privilege, and whatever she was running from was dangerous enough that she'd risk her children's lives rather than face it. On the second day after the storm, Sam was splitting firewood behind his cabin when he heard the sound of horses approaching. In 7 years of living in this isolated valley, he'd had maybe a dozen unexpected visitors, and most of them had been lost travelers or Indians passing through. The sound of multiple horses moving at a steady pace suggested something more organized and potentially more dangerous. Sam set down his axe and moved carefully to the corner of his cabin, where he could see the approach without being seen himself. 3 riders were making their way up the valley, following the creek bed where the snow was shallowest. They weren't trappers or settlers. Their horses were too good, their clothes too clean, their posture too military. These were men with a purpose, and Sam had a sinking feeling he knew what that purpose was. He slipped back inside the cabin and found Abby teaching Hannah how to braid her hair while Jacob worked on a puzzle Sam had carved from wood scraps. The domestic scene was so peaceful it almost broke his heart to interrupt it. "Abby," he said quietly, "we've got company coming." 3 men on horseback, moving like they're looking for something specific. The color drained from Abby's face so quickly Sam thought she might faint. "Oh God," she whispered. "They found us." "Who found us?" Jacob asked, his young face suddenly frightened. "No one, sweetheart," Abby said, but her voice shook. "Just some travelers, probably." Sam knelt down to Jacob's level. Son, I need you and your sister to go into the back room and stay there until I say it's safe to come out. Can you do that for me?" Jacob nodded solemnly, clearly understanding that this was serious even if he didn't understand why. He took Hannah's hand and led her to the small storage room Sam used for supplies, closing the door quietly behind them. "Tell me the truth," Sam said to Abby once the children were out of earshot. "Who are those men, and what do they want?" Abby was shaking now, her hands clasped so tightly together her knuckles were bone white. "They work for my husband," she said finally. "My real husband, Charles Ashford." "I thought your husband was dead." "Thomas Morgan is dead. Charles Ashford is very much alive and he wants his wife and children back." In the few minutes before the riders reached his cabin, Abby told Sam a story that explained everything and changed his understanding of the woman he'd rescued completely. Margaret Whitmore had been 19 when she married Charles Ashford, one of the wealthiest railroad barons in the Midwest. It should have been a fairy tale, a young woman from a modest family elevated to a life of luxury and privilege. Instead, it had been a nightmare that lasted 3 years. Charles Ashford was a man who collected beautiful things and expected them to remain perfect and obedient. Margaret had been his wife in name, but in reality she'd been his possession, kept in a gilded cage and displayed at social functions like a prize he'd won. When she'd tried to assert any independence, Charles had made it clear that he owned her completely and that defying him would have consequences. "He told me that if I ever tried to leave him, he'd make sure I never saw my children again," Abby said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He had lawyers, judges, politicians in his pocket. He could have had me declared insane, unfit to be a mother." I believed him. But when Charles had started showing the same controlling behavior toward Jacob and Hannah, demanding that they be sent to boarding schools where he could shape them into proper Ashford's, Margaret had known she had to act. She'd spent months planning her escape, creating the false identity of Abigail Morgan, arranging for forged papers, and slowly moving money to accounts Charles couldn't access. "Thomas Morgan was a man I met in Chicago who was dying of consumption," she explained. "He had no family, no one who would miss him. I paid him to marry me legally, knowing he wouldn't live long enough for it to matter. When he died, I became a legitimate widow with a legal claim to my own identity. The plan had been to disappear completely, to take the children and start over somewhere Charles could never find them. But Charles Ashford hadn't become one of the richest men in America by accepting defeat. He'd hired the best private investigators money could buy, and they'd been tracking Margaret across the country for months. "We were so close," Abby said, tears streaming down her face. "Fort Dakota was just supposed to be a way station. There's a man there who helps people disappear completely, for a price. New identities, passage to Canada, places Charles could never reach us." The sound of horses stopped outside Sam's cabin, followed by the creak of leather and the soft thud of boots hitting snow. Sam checked his rifle, made sure it was loaded, and positioned himself by the window where he could see the 3 men who had dismounted and were studying the tracks around his cabin. The leader was a tall man in an expensive coat with the kind of pale indoor complexion that spoke of city living and office work. But his eyes were hard and calculating, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to getting what he wanted. The other 2 were clearly hired muscle-big men with the kind of faces that advertised their willingness to use violence to solve problems. "Samuel Rivers?" the leader called out. "I'm Detective Morrison, representing the Ashford family of Chicago. We have reason to believe you're harboring a kidnapper and 2 stolen children." Sam stepped outside, his rifle held casually but ready. "Don't know what you're talking about. Haven't seen anyone but you 3 in weeks." Morrison smiled, but it was the cold smile of a snake preparing to strike. "Now, Mr. Rivers, let's not play games. We know Margaret Ashford and the children are here. We followed their trail from the wagon wreck. This can go easy or hard, but either way, we're taking them back to Chicago where they belong. Like I said, haven't seen anyone matching that description. One of the hired men stepped forward, his hand moving to the gun on his hip. Maybe we should take a look inside, just to be sure. Sam's rifle came up slightly, not quite pointing at anyone, but making its presence very clear. I don't think so. This is my property, and you're not welcome on it. Morrison held up a hand to stop his man from escalating things further. Mr. Rivers, I can see you're a reasonable man. Charles Ashford is offering a substantial reward for the safe return of his family. $5,000, cash money. That's more than you'd make trapping in 10 years. Not interested in your money? Then perhaps you're interested in staying out of prison. Harboring kidnapped children is a federal crime. We have arrest warrants signed by a federal judge. You help us, and you walk away rich. You keep interfering, and you'll spend the next 20 years breaking rocks in a federal penitentiary. Inside the cabin, Sam knew Abby was listening to every word, her heart breaking as she realized that once again, she was trapped by Charles Ashford's money and influence. The children were hidden, but not well enough to withstand a thorough search. And 3 armed men against one, even on his own territory, were not odds Sam liked. But as he stood there in the snow, facing down men who represented everything he'd come west to escape the corruption, the power of money over justice, the willingness of the strong to crush the weak, Sam Rivers made a decision that surprised even him. You boys have got about 10 seconds to get back on your horses and ride out of my valley, he said, his voice calm and steady. After that, I start shooting, and I don't miss. Morrison's face hardened. You're making a serious mistake, Rivers. Maybe, but it's my mistake to make. The tension stretched tight as a bowstring, 3 armed men facing one across 20 feet of snow-covered ground. Sam could feel sweat on his palms despite the cold, could hear his own heartbeat loud in his ears. This was the moment when everything would be decided, whether money and power would win again, or whether one man's stubborn refusal to back down would be enough to protect the innocent. Morrison reached into his coat, and Sam's finger tightened on his trigger. But instead of a gun, the detective pulled out a folded paper. Federal warrant, he said, holding it up. Signed and sealed. You're obstructing justice, Rivers. Your justice and mine might be 2 different things, Sam replied. Now you're down to 5 seconds. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but it was broken by the sound of the cabin door opening behind Sam. Abby stepped out into the snow, her face pale but determined, her children clinging to her sides. It's all right, Sam, she said quietly. I won't let you get hurt because of us. Morrison smiled triumphantly. Margaret, you've led us quite a chase. My name is Abigail. Morgan, she said firmly. And these are my children, not mine. The courts will decide that. Right now you're coming back to Chicago to face charges of kidnapping and theft. Abby looked at Sam, her eyes full of gratitude and sorrow. Thank you, she whispered. For everything. You gave us 2 days of freedom, and that's more than we've had in years. But Sam Rivers wasn't finished fighting. He'd made his choice, and he was going to see it through, no matter what it cost him. The war had taught him that some things were worth dying for, and protecting the innocent was one of them. As Morrison's men moved forward to take Abby and the children into custody, Sam made a decision that would turn a simple rescue into a fight for survival that would echo across the Dakota territory for years to come. The moment Detective Morrison's hired guns stepped forward to seize Abby and the children, Sam Rivers did something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Pulled the trigger. The crack of his rifle split the morning air like thunder, and Morrison's lead man spun around and dropped into the snow, clutching his shoulder and screaming curses that would have made a cavalry sergeant blush. Next one goes between the eyes, Sam said, his voice deadly calm as he worked the bolt action and chambered another round. Your choice, gentlemen. Everything changed in that instant. What had been a tense negotiation became a gunfight, and Sam found himself facing two armed men who were no longer interested in taking prisoners alive. Morrison dove behind his horse while the remaining hired gun went for his pistol, forcing Sam to duck back around the corner of his cabin as bullets splintered the wood where his head had been. "Get inside," Sam shouted to Abby as lead flew in. "Every direction. Take the children and get down." Abby didn't need to be told twice. She grabbed Jacob and Hannah and rushed them back into the cabin, slamming the door behind her just as Morrison's remaining gunman put 3 shots through the window where she'd been standing. Glass exploded inward and Sam heard Hannah scream. From inside the cabin, Sam had fought in the war, had faced Confederate charges across open fields, and held trenches against overwhelming odds. But this was different. This was personal. These weren't soldiers fighting for a cause they believed in. These were hired killers come to steal children from their mother, and that made them something lower than animals in Sam's estimation. Wounded man was still screaming and bleeding in the snow, but he was out of the fight. Morrison had taken cover behind his horse and was shouting orders to his remaining man, trying to coordinate an assault on the cabin. But they'd made a tactical error that Sam intended to exploit. They'd gotten off their horses in open ground, with no real cover except for their mounts. While Sam had the advantage of fighting from a defensive position, he knew intimately Sam had built his cabin with defense in mind, though he'd never expected to need it against human enemies. The logs were thick enough to stop rifle bullets. The windows were positioned to give good fields of fire in all directions, and he'd stockpiled enough ammunition inside to hold off a small army. What he hadn't planned for was having innocent civilians trapped inside while bullets flew. "Abby," he called through the shattered window. "Are the children hurt?" "We're all right," came her shaky reply. "Hannah's scared, but no one's bleeding. There's a root cellar under the trapdoor in the back room. Get down there and stay down until I tell you it's safe." Sam heard movement inside the cabin as Abby moved the children to the safest place available. Meanwhile, Morrison and his man were trying to figure out how to assault a fortified position held by someone who clearly knew how to shoot. They had numbers, but Sam had position and motivation, a dangerous combination for anyone trying to take him down. "Rivers," Morrison shouted from behind his horse. "You're only making this worse for yourself. Surrender now, and we'll make sure you're treated fairly." Sam answered with a rifle shot that sent Morrison diving for better cover. "Come and take me," he called back. "But you better bring more men." The gunfight that followed was unlike anything Sam had experienced, even in the war. Morrison and his surviving gunmen tried to flank the cabin, forcing Sam to move constantly, from window to window to keep them pinned down. They had plenty of ammunition and no shortage of determination, but they were fighting in unfamiliar territory against a man who knew every rock and tree in the valley. Sam used that knowledge ruthlessly. When Morrison's man tried to circle around to the back of the cabin, Sam was waiting for him at the rear window. When they attempted to rush the front door, Sam drove them back with accurate rifle fire that proved he hadn't been boasting about his marksmanship. The snow around the cabin was soon churned up with boot prints and stained with blood from the wounded man, who had crawled behind a fallen log and was doing his best to return fire despite his injury. The siege went on for nearly 2 hours, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. Morrison's men had Sam pinned inside his cabin, but they couldn't get close enough to finish him off without exposing themselves to his deadly accurate shooting. Sam had wounded one and kept the others at bay, but he was running low on ammunition and knew he couldn't hold them off forever. It was during a brief lull in the gunfire that Sam heard something that chilled his blood, the sound of more horses approaching from the south. Morrison had brought reinforcements, or Charles Ashford had sent additional men to make sure the job got done. Either way, Sam's situation had just gone from difficult to hopeless. But when the new arrivals came into view, Sam realized that fortune had taken an unexpected turn. The approaching riders weren't more of Morrison's men. They were a patrol from Fort Dakota, led by Captain William Hayes, a man Sam had met during his infrequent trips to trade furs. The captain was a decent sort, one of the few military men Sam had encountered who seemed more interested in keeping the peace than in throwing his weight around. "What in the hell is going on here?" Captain Hayes demanded as his patrol of 6 soldiers spread out around the clearing, their rifles ready but not yet pointed at anyone specific. Morrison emerged from behind his horse, his expensive clothes torn and dirty from crawling around in the snow. "Captain Hayes, thank God you're here. This man is harboring kidnapped children and has fired on federal officers attempting to execute lawful warrants." Captain Hayes looked from Morrison to Sam, who was still visible at his cabin window with his rifle at the ready. "Is that true?" "Rivers, depends on how you define kidnapped," Sam called back. "These men are trying to drag a woman and her children back to a man who's been beating them. The woman came to me for help, and I gave it. The woman is Margaret Ashford, wife of Charles Ashford of Chicago," Morrison said, producing his papers. "These are federal warrants for her arrest on charges of kidnapping and theft. She has no legal right to those children." Captain Hayes examined the warrants with the thoroughness of a man who'd learned not to trust every piece of paper shoved under his nose. "These appear to be in order," he said finally. "But I'm curious about something, Detective Morrison. How did you know to come to this specific valley looking for these people?" Morrison hesitated for just a moment, but it was enough to tell Sam that the man was hiding something. "We followed their trail from the wagon wreck," he said finally. "That's interesting," Captain Hayes replied, "because we found that wagon wreck 2 days ago, and the trail from it led in 3 different directions thanks to the wind. It would have taken a hell of a tracker to follow the right one to this cabin, almost like you knew exactly where to look." Captain Hayes was no fool, and neither were the men under his command. They'd spent years on the frontier dealing with all kinds of criminals, con men, and corrupt officials. When something didn't smell right, they noticed, and Morrison's story was beginning to stink like a week-old fish. "Captain," Sam called from his cabin, "if you'll guarantee safe passage, the lady will come out and tell you her side of the story. But she's not going anywhere with these men until a proper court decides what's legal and what isn't." Hayes nodded. "You have my word, Rivers. No one gets taken anywhere until I understand what's really happening here." Abby emerged from the cabin, with Jacob and Hannah clinging to her sides, their young faces frightened but determined. She'd managed to clean herself up somewhat during the siege, and in the clear morning light, it was obvious that she was a lady of quality who'd fallen on hard times. Her bearing, her speech, her manner with the children, everything about her suggested breeding and education. "Ma'am," Captain Hayes said, touching his hat respectfully, "I'm Captain Hayes, Fort Dakota. I understand there's some confusion about your identity and the custody of these children." "There's no confusion, Captain," Abby said firmly. "My name is Abigail Morgan, and these are my children. I was married to Thomas Morgan of Chicago, who died 6 months ago. I came west seeking a new start, and my wagon was caught in the blizzard. Mr. Rivers saved our lives." Morrison started to protest, but Hayes held up a hand for silence. "Ma'am, this gentleman claims you're actually Margaret Ashford, and that you've kidnapped these children from their legal father. He has warrants for your arrest." Abby's composure never wavered. "Charles Ashford was my first husband, Captain. Our marriage was annulled when I discovered he was already married to another woman at the time of our ceremony. The children are mine by blood, and Thomas Morgan legally adopted them when we married. I have the papers to prove it." It was a masterful performance, mixing truth with carefully crafted lies in a way that cast doubt on Morrison's entire story. Sam watched from his cabin window as the detective's face grew red with frustration. "She's lying," Morrison sputtered. "Charles Ashford is one of the most respected businessmen in Chicago. He would never. Then you won't mind if we wire Chicago and verify these claims, Captain Hayes said smoothly. It'll take a few days for the messages to go back and forth. But we should be able to get this sorted out properly. Morrison's face went pale. That's not necessary, Captain. We have our orders. From who exactly? Hayes asked. Because those warrants were issued awfully fast for such a complex domestic case. Almost like someone with a lot of influence was pushing them through the system without proper investigation. What happened next would become legend in the Dakota Territory for years to come. Captain Hayes, suspicious of Morrison's evasive answers and the convenient speed with which the warrants had been issued, decided to conduct his own investigation right there in the snow outside Sam's cabin. It started when one of Hayes's sergeants recognized Morrison's wounded man as Jake Crawford, a known gunfighter and killer with outstanding warrants in 3 territories. That led to a more thorough search of the men's belongings, which revealed things that no legitimate federal officers would have been carrying. In Morrison's saddlebags, they found a small arsenal of weapons, enough cash to buy a small ranch, and most damning of all, a letter of credit drawn on Charles Ashford's personal bank account for $10,000, far more than any reasonable reward for the return of kidnapped children, and certainly more than federal officers would be carrying on official business. Hunters, Captain Hayes said with disgust as he examined the evidence. Well-funded bounty hunters, but bounty hunters all the same. Those warrants might be real, but you boys aren't federal officers, are you? Morrison's remaining hired gun decided at that moment that discretion was the better part of valor. He threw down his weapons and surrendered, leaving Morrison standing alone in the snow with his expensive clothes and his worthless papers. This is outrageous, Morrison protested. Charles Ashford is a rich man who hired killers to steal children, Captain Hayes interrupted. That makes him a criminal in my book, and you his accomplices. The wounded gunman, Jake Crawford, decided to save his own neck by telling everything he knew. Charles Ashford had indeed hired them to track down his wife and children, but not through any legal process. Ashford had used his influence to get warrants issued based on false testimony, then hired Morrison and his men to bring back Margaret and the children by any means necessary. He didn't much care if they came back alive, Crawford admitted, his shoulder still bleeding. Said dead wives can't testify about what happened in their marriage, and orphaned children are easier to control. The revelation that Charles Ashford had essentially put out contracts on his own wife and children changed everything. Captain Hayes arrested Morrison and his surviving men on charges ranging from attempted murder to conspiracy to commit kidnapping. The federal warrants, obtained through fraud and perjury, were declared invalid pending a full investigation, but the real victory belonged to Abby and her children. For the first time in years, they were truly free from Charles Ashford's reach. His attempt to use hired killers to retrieve his property had backfired spectacularly, exposing him as the monster he really was and destroying any legal claim he might have had to the children. "Ma'am," Captain Hayes said to Abby as his men prepared to transport their prisoners back to Fort Dakota, "you and your children are free to go wherever you want. As far as the United States Army is concerned, you're a widow named Abigail Morgan, traveling west with her family." Abby's composure finally cracked, and she began to cry not from fear or sadness, but from relief so profound it shook her entire body. Jacob and Hannah clung to her sides, not fully understanding what had happened, but sensing that the danger that had followed them across half the continent was finally gone. Sam emerged from his cabin, his rifle still in his hands but no longer needed. The valley that had been a battlefield an hour earlier was now peaceful again, with only the blood-stained snow to mark where violence had briefly reigned. "What now?" he asked Abby as Captain Hayes and his men prepared to leave. Abby looked around the valley, at the cabin that had sheltered them, at the man who'd risked everything to protect them, at the endless expanse of prairie that stretched toward the horizon. For the first time in years, she had choices, real choices, made freely without fear of retribution. "I don't know," she said honestly. "We're free now, really free. We can go anywhere, be anyone we want to be." Sam nodded, understanding the magnitude of what she was facing. "Well," he said quietly, "this valley's got room for a few more people, if you're interested in staying. Can't promise it'll be easy, but it'll be honest." Abby looked at him, this rough, solitary man who'd thrown away his peaceful existence to protect strangers, who'd faced down hired killers without hesitation when children were threatened. She thought about the choices that lay before her, about the life she could build away from the corruption and violence of her past. "I'd like that," she said finally. "I'd like that very much." As Captain Hayes and his prisoners disappeared over the southern ridge, the valley settled back into the peaceful silence that had been broken by gunfire and blood. But it was a different kind of peace now, not the lonely isolation of a hermit's existence, but the comfortable quiet of a place where people who'd found each other could begin to build something new. The snow began to fall again, gentle flakes that would soon cover the bloodstains and erase all evidence of the violence that had briefly shattered the morning calm. By evening, the valley would look exactly as it had before Morrison and his men arrived. But everything had changed, and nothing would ever be the same again. 3 weeks after the gunfight that had transformed Sam Rivers from a solitary trapper into an unlikely protector, the reality of what they'd all committed to was beginning to sink in. Abby Morgan, she'd legally reclaimed that name now, burying Margaret Whitmore, forever stood at the window of Sam's cabin, watching her children play in the snow, and marveled at how different their laughter sounded when it wasn't. Shadowed by fear, the transition hadn't been easy. Jacob still woke up screaming some nights, reliving nightmares about his stepfather's threats and the violence of their escape. Hannah had developed a stutter that came out whenever she was nervous, which was often in those early days. And Abby herself struggled with the simple act of making decisions. After years of having every choice made for her by controlling men, the freedom to choose what to cook for dinner or when to go to bed felt overwhelming. But Sam Rivers had proven to be more than just a fierce protector. He was patient with the children's fears, gentle with their questions, and understanding about the time it would take for all of them to heal from the wounds Charles Ashford had inflicted. He'd given up his solitary existence without complaint, sharing his small cabin and his carefully hoarded supplies as if he'd been planning for this family all along. The practical challenges were immense. Sam's cabin had been built for one person, not 4. His food stores, carefully calculated to last one man through the winter, were stretched dangerously thin, feeding 3 additional mouths. His trap lines, neglected during the crisis, needed to be rebuilt from scratch. And winter in the Dakota Territory was far from over. They still faced 2 months of bitter cold and potential storms that could cut them off from the outside world for weeks at a time. But perhaps the greatest challenge was learning to trust each other completely. Sam had to overcome 7 years of deliberate isolation, remembering how to live with other people and share his space with children who had boundless energy and curiosity. Abby had to learn that not all men used protection as a means of control, that Sam's care for her family came without strings attached or hidden expectations. And the children had to learn that they could be loud and playful and happy without fear of punishment or consequences. The first major project was expanding the cabin to accommodate 4 people instead of 1. Sam had always been handy with tools. Frontier life demanded self-sufficiency, but he'd never attempted anything as ambitious as adding an entire room to an existing structure in the middle of winter. "We need more space," he told Abby one morning as they watched Jacob and Hannah practice reading from the one book. Sam owned a collection of Frontier tailies he'd bought years earlier, but never had time to enjoy. "The children need a proper place to sleep, and you need privacy." Abby looked around the cramped cabin that had been their sanctuary. but was rapidly becoming too small for their growing family. Can it be done? Adding a room in winter? It'll be hard work, and we'll have to be careful about keeping the cold out while we're building. But I've got timber from trees I cut down last summer that's been seasoning. If we work smart and plan carefully, we can have it done before the worst of the winter weather hits. The project became a family endeavor that brought them closer together while teaching the children valuable skills. Jacob, eager to prove himself useful, helped Sam measure lumber and learn to use basic tools safely. Hannah, too small for construction work but determined not to be left out, became the official supplier of nails and small hardware, organizing Sam's tools with the meticulous care of someone who took her responsibilities seriously. Abby surprised herself by how much she enjoyed the physical labor. Years of pampered living in Chicago had left her soft and unused to manual work, but there was something deeply satisfying about building something with her own hands, creating a space that would be truly theirs. She learned to chink logs with mud and moss, to hang a door so it would swing properly, and to install a window that would let in light without letting in too much cold. The work was slow and sometimes frustrating. Winter construction meant dealing with lumber so cold it could crack unexpectedly, mortar that froze before it could set properly, and tools that became brittle in the extreme temperatures. But gradually, a new room took shape, a space that would serve as a bedroom for Abby and Hannah, giving the family the privacy they needed while keeping them close enough for warmth and security. As the winter progressed, and their living situation stabilized, they established routines that helped bind them together as a family unit. Sam discovered that he enjoyed teaching the children about frontier life skills that might someday save their lives in this harsh country. He showed Jacob how to read animal tracks in the snow, how to set snares for rabbits and squirrels, how to identify which plants could be eaten safely and which could kill you. Hannah proved to have an intuitive understanding of animals that amazed Sam. She could calm his horses with a touch, seemed to know instinctively when the weather was going to change, and had a gift for finding bird nests and other wildlife signs that even experienced trappers might miss. Under Sam's patient tutelage, she learned to move silently through the forest, to observe without disturbing, and to understand the natural rhythms that governed life in the wilderness. But the education flowed both ways. Abby had received a refined education in Chicago, and she was determined that her children wouldn't lose the advantages of literacy and learning just because they were living on the frontier. She taught them mathematics, geography, and history, using Sam's cabin as a one-room schoolhouse and improvising teaching materials from whatever was available. More importantly, she taught Sam things he'd never learned during his rough frontier existence. She showed him how to cook meals that were more than just functional sustenance, how to organize a household so that everything had its place, and how to create an atmosphere of warmth and comfort that made their cabin feel like a real home rather than just a shelter from the cold. It was during a particularly fierce blizzard in late March that Sam realized just how completely his life had changed. The storm had blown in without warning, trapping them inside the cabin for 3 days with nothing to do but wait for the weather to pass. 7 years earlier, such a storm would have meant 3 days of lonely solitude, broken only by the necessity of caring for his horses and keeping his fire burning. Instead, he found himself in the middle of a warm, bustling household full of conversation, laughter, and shared activities. Jacob had become fascinated with Sam's collection of hand tools and spent hours learning to carve wood under Sam's careful supervision. Hannah had appointed herself the family storyteller, making up elaborate tales about the animals they could hear moving around outside the cabin during the storm. Abby had taken over most of the cooking, transforming Sam's simple frontier fare into meals that actually tasted good and provided proper nutrition for growing children. She'd also begun teaching them all to read better, using the Bible Sam had inherited from his mother as a textbook and encouraging each of them to take turns reading aloud in the evenings, but it was the small moments that really showed Sam how much his life had changed. The way Hannah would unconsciously lean against his leg while he worked on his traps. The way Jacob looked to him for approval when he'd mastered a new skill. The way Abby's face would light up when she laughed at something funny, no longer the haunted expression of a woman living in fear. During that storm, Sam realized that he'd accidentally acquired something he'd never thought he wanted: a family. Not through marriage or blood, but through the simple act of people choosing to take care of each other when it mattered most. They'd become bound together by shared danger, mutual need, and growing affection in a way that felt more real and lasting than many legal relationships he'd observed. But building a new life wasn't without its difficulties. The children had to adjust to frontier realities that were far different from their pampered existence in Chicago. There were no servants to clean up after them, no cooks to prepare elaborate meals, no tutors to provide entertainment when they were bored. Everyone had to contribute to the household's survival, and that meant learning to work even when you didn't feel like it. Jacob struggled with the physical demands of frontier life. He'd been raised as a gentleman's son, expected to look neat and clean and well-behaved at all times. Learning to chop wood, haul water, and tend animals was hard work that left him tired and often frustrated. But Sam was patient with his mistakes and encouraging about his progress, and gradually the boy developed the confidence and skills he needed to be genuinely helpful rather than just trying to help. Hannah's main challenge was learning to control her natural curiosity in an environment where mistakes could be dangerous. She wanted to explore everything, touch everything, try everything, an impulse that could be deadly when dealing with wild animals, extreme weather, or the various tools and weapons necessary for frontier survival. Sam and Abby had to teach her to think before acting, to ask questions before taking risks, and to understand that some rules existed not to limit her freedom, but to keep her alive. Abby faced, perhaps, the greatest adjustment of all. She'd spent her entire adult life being told what to do, first by her parents, then by Charles Ashford, and finally by the necessity of fleeing for her life. Learning to make independent decisions about everything from daily routines to long-term plans was both liberating and terrifying. She had to overcome years of conditioning that had taught her to defer to male authority and trust her own judgment about what was best for her family. The real test of their new family came with the arrival of spring, when the snow began to melt and travel became possible again. For the first time since the blizzard that had brought them together, they had contact with the outside world, and with it, the reminder that their life in the valley was a choice they were making every day, not just a temporary shelter from immediate danger. Captain Hayes visited in early April, bringing news from Fort Dakota and the wider world. Charles Ashford had been arrested in Chicago on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, based on the testimony of Jake Crawford and the evidence Hayes had collected. Morrison had been convicted of attempted murder and sentenced to 20 years in territorial prison. The federal warrants that had seemed so threatening were now just pieces of paper with no legal weight. "You're free to go anywhere you want, ma'am," Hayes told Abby as they sat around Sam's dinner table, sharing a meal of venison stew and fresh bread. "Ashford can't touch you or the children now. His reputation is ruined, his business is under investigation, and he'll be lucky if he doesn't spend the rest of his life in prison." It was the news Abby had dreamed of hearing for years complete. Freedom from the man who had made her life a nightmare. But as she looked around the cabin that had become home, at the children who were thriving in their new environment, and at Sam who had become so much more than just their protector, she realized that freedom wasn't about running away anymore. It was about choosing where to stay. "Thank you, Captain," she said finally, "but I think we're exactly where we want to be." Hayes smiled, understanding more than he said. "This is good country for people who want to start over. Harsh, but honest. If you stay, you'll need to file homestead claims to make it legal. but I don't think you'll have any trouble proving you can work the land and make it productive." As spring advanced and the weather grew warmer, they began making plans for their first full year as a family. Sam's trapping income alone wouldn't be enough to support 4 people, so they needed to diversify their sources of livelihood. Abby proposed starting a small market garden to provide vegetables for their own use and to sell at Fort Dakota. Jacob wanted to learn more about animal husbandry, suggesting they acquire some chickens and perhaps a milk cow. Hannah advocated for beekeeping, having read about it in one of Sam's books and being fascinated by the idea of honey production. Sam listened to their plans with growing amazement. A year ago, his biggest concern had been whether his trap lines would produce enough fur to buy supplies for another solitary winter. Now he was contemplating livestock, agriculture, and business ventures that would tie him permanently to this valley and to this family. The changes went deeper than just practical planning. Sam found himself thinking about the future in ways he hadn't since before the war, not just survival from one season to the next, but building something lasting that could be passed down to the next generation. He watched Jacob learning to use tools and saw a young man who could someday expand their operations, maybe even build his own cabin nearby and raise his own family in the valley. He watched Hannah's quick mind absorb everything she was taught and imagined her becoming a teacher or a healer, someone who could help other frontier families the way Sam had helped hers. And when he looked at Abby, he saw not just a woman he'd rescued from a blizzard, but a partner who complemented his strengths and compensated for his weaknesses. She brought organization, education, and civilized comfort to his rough frontier existence. He provided protection, practical skills, and the kind of steady reliability that allowed her to heal from years of abuse and control. They hadn't talked about marriage. It was too soon, and both of them were still adjusting to the dramatic changes in their circumstances. But Sam found himself thinking about it more and more as spring turned towards summer and their temporary arrangement began to feel permanent. Not because Abby needed his protection anymore, but because they'd built something together that neither of them wanted to lose. As the snow finally melted completely and revealed the valley in all its spring beauty, Sam Rivers realized that his life as a solitary hermit was truly over. In its place was something he'd never dared to hope for: a family, a home, and a future that stretched beyond mere survival into the possibility of genuine happiness. The woman and children he'd found dying in a blizzard had saved his life just as surely as he'd saved theirs. Together, they were building something new in the Dakota wilderness, not just a homestead, but a place where people who'd been broken by the world could heal, grow, and discover what it meant to be truly free. Summer had painted the Dakota Valley in shades of green and gold that made Sam Rivers forget, sometimes, that this land could be as deadly as it was beautiful. The family had settled into a rhythm of prosperity and contentment that felt almost too good to be true, which, as it turned out, it was. The trouble arrived on a sweltering July afternoon in the form of a lone rider leading a pack mule loaded with surveyor's equipment. Sam was teaching Jacob how to properly shoe a horse when the stranger appeared at the mouth of their valley, his silhouette wavering in the heat like a mirage. But this was no illusion. The man was real, and Sam's instincts, honed by years of frontier living and sharpened by recent violence, immediately told him that this visitor brought danger. The rider was a thin, nervous-looking man in his 40s, wearing clothes that marked him as a city dweller trying to look frontier-ready. His horse was good quality but soft, the kind of animal that looked impressive in a corral, but would struggle with the hard travel required in this country. Most telling of all was the way the man constantly scanned the horizon, as if he expected trouble to come riding over every ridge. "Afternoon," the stranger called out as he approached Sam's cabin, his voice carrying the nasal accent of the eastern cities. "Name's Edmund Graves, territorial surveyor. I'm looking for Samuel Rivers." Sam straightened slowly, his hand instinctively moving closer to the rifle that was never far from his reach. You found him. What's your business here? Graves dismounted, with the awkward movements of someone more accustomed to carriages than horses. I have some papers for you, Mr. Rivers. Legal documents that require your immediate attention. Abby had emerged from the cabin at the sound of voices, wiping her hands on her apron. She'd been teaching Hannah how to preserve vegetables for winter storage, work that had filled the cabin with the pleasant smells of herbs and pickling spices. But the tension in Sam's posture told her immediately that this was no friendly social call. What kind of legal documents? Sam asked, making no move to accept the papers Graves was pulling from his saddlebags. Land surveys, mostly. Official. Territorial business. It seems there's been some question about property boundaries in this area, and certain parties have filed claims that might affect your situation here. The way Graves said situation made it clear he knew exactly who Abby and the children were, despite the months that had passed since their arrival. Sam felt the familiar cold anger that had carried him through the war beginning to build in his chest. This land's been my home for 7 years, Sam said evenly. Never had any problems with boundaries before. Graves smiled, but it was the kind of smile that belonged on a snake preparing to strike. Well, that's the thing about legal boundaries, Mr. Rivers. They're not always the same as practical ones. And it seems someone with considerable influence has taken an interest in this particular valley. The documents Graves finally produced were a bureaucratic nightmare designed to confuse and intimidate. There were surveys showing conflicting boundary lines, territorial claims filed by parties with names Sam had never heard of, and most ominously, a notice of eminent domain proceedings that would allow the territorial government to seize private property for public works projects. Abby examined the papers with the careful attention of someone who'd learned, through bitter experience, to read the fine print in legal documents. What she found there made her blood run cold. Sam, she said quietly, these surveys show our valley as part of a proposed railway route. The territorial government is claiming the right to seize all property in the path for railroad construction. Railroad? Jacob asked, looking up from where he'd been practicing his letters on a slate board. Are they going to build a train through our valley? Graves answered before Sam could speak. The Dakota Northern Railway has been granted territorial authority to construct a line from Fort Dakota to the mining camps in the Black Hills. This valley represents the most efficient route through the mountains, and the territorial legislature has authorized the use of eminent domain to acquire the necessary land. Sam studied the surveyor's face, reading the tells that marked him as a man delivering a prepared speech rather than honest information. That's interesting, Mr. Graves, because I happen to know that the Dakota Northern Railway doesn't exist. Captain Hayes mentioned it to me last month, said there'd been some speculation about railroad development, but no actual companies had been formed and no territorial authority had been granted. Graves's composure slipped for just a moment, long enough for Sam to see the fear in his eyes. Perhaps the captain's information is outdated, or perhaps you're lying. Sam's voice carried the kind of quiet menace that had made Confederate soldiers think twice about testing his resolve during the war. The question is, who sent you here with fake papers, and what do they really want? The truth came out in pieces, extracted through a combination of Sam's intimidating presence and Abby's sharp questioning. Edmund Graves wasn't really a territorial surveyor, he was a private investigator, hired by a consortium of businessmen in Chicago to find legal ways to force the Morgan family out of their refuge in the Dakota Territory. Charles Ashford, even from his prison cell, had not given up his obsession with reclaiming what he considered his property. Unable to use direct violence after the failure of Morrison's expedition, he'd convinced business associates to pursue a different strategy: legal harassment designed to make life impossible for the woman who dared to defy him. He wants you ruined, Graves admitted when Sam's patience finally ran out, and the trapper made it clear that the surveyor would be eating his fake documents if he didn't start telling the truth. Ashford's convinced his partners that you're sitting on valuable mineral rights, that this valley could be worth a fortune if properly developed. He's offered them a partnership in exchange for driving you out. The scope of Ashford's reach was more extensive than any of them had imagined. Through his business connections and carefully placed bribes, he'd managed to create a web of corruption that extended all the way to the territorial capital. Fake railroad companies, fraudulent mineral surveys, manufactured legal disputes, all designed to create enough bureaucratic chaos to force Sam and his family off their land. There are more like me coming, Graves warned as Sam and Abby absorbed the magnitude of what they were facing. Lawyers, territorial officials, federal marshals with warrants based on false claims. Ashford spent a fortune on this campaign, and he's got friends in high places who owe him favors. Abby felt the familiar cold fear that had driven her across. Half the continent settling in her stomach. He's never going to stop, is he? Even from prison, he's still trying to destroy us. Sam looked at the woman who'd become the center of his world, at the children who'd filled his lonely existence with laughter and purpose, and felt something harder than anger crystallizing in his chest. He'd thought the fight was over when Morrison and his men were defeated, but now he understood that Charles Ashford was like a cancer cutting out one tumor didn't stop the disease from spreading. Maybe not, Sam said quietly. But there's more than one way to fight a war. Jacob, who'd been listening to the adults' conversation with the solemn attention of a child forced to grow up too fast, spoke up with a question that cut to the heart of the matter. Are we going to have to run away again? It was Hannah who answered, her young voice filled with a determination that reminded Sam powerfully of her mother. No, this is our home. Nobody gets to take our home away from us. That evening, after Graves had been sent on his way with a warning never to return to their valley, Sam and Abby sat by the fire planning their own campaign against Charles Ashford's legal assault. They had advantages that the railroad baron had overlooked in his arrogance. They understood the frontier in ways his city-bred associates never could, and they had allies who valued justice over profit. Captain Hayes needs to know about this, Abby said as she studied the fake documents by firelight. If Ashford's people are using fraudulent federal warrants, that's a federal crime. Hayes has connections in Washington. He might be able to cut through the corruption at its source. Sam nodded, already planning the trip to Fort Dakota. We'll need more than military help, though. If Ashford's got territorial officials in his pocket, we need to find honest ones who can't be bought. There's something else, Abby said hesitantly. Something I never told you about the time I spent planning my escape from Charles. I wasn't the only woman trying to get away from him. Sam looked at her sharply. What do you mean? Charles had a pattern. Young women, usually from families that needed money. He'd marry them, control them completely, and when they tried to resist or escape. Abby's voice trailed off, but Sam understood. You think there were others? I know there were others. I met some of them, women who'd managed to get away but were too terrified to speak out against him. If we could find them, get them to testify about what Charles really is. It was a dangerous strategy, one that would require Abby to come out of hiding and risk exposure to Charles's remaining allies. But it might also be their only chance to strike back at the source of their problems, rather than just defending against each new attack. Over the next several weeks, Sam and Abby launched a carefully coordinated campaign to expose Charles Ashford's corruption and build a network of allies who could protect them from his reach. Sam traveled to Fort Dakota and beyond, meeting with territorial officials, federal marshals, and military commanders who still believed in honest law enforcement. What he found was disturbing but not entirely surprising. Ashford's influence extended far beyond Chicago, reaching into territorial politics and federal bureaucracy through a combination of bribery, blackmail, and the kind of old boy networking that marked the highest levels of American business and politics. But Sam also found cracks in Ashford's seemingly impenetrable armor. Honest officials who'd been frustrated by corruption they couldn't prove. Military officers who resented civilian interference in territorial law enforcement. Federal investigators who'd been tracking Ashford's business practices for other reasons, and were interested in any evidence of criminal activity. Meanwhile, Abby began the delicate process of reaching out to other women who'd suffered under Charles Ashford's control. Using carefully coded letters sent through intermediaries, she made contact with former wives, domestic servants, and business associates who'd witnessed Ashford's true nature but had been too afraid to speak out. The response was both heartening and heartbreaking. Women across the Midwest had stories of Charles Ashford's abuse, manipulation, and violence. Some had escaped as Abby had, changing their names and disappearing into the vastness of the frontier. Others had been broken by his control, reduced to shadows of their former selves. A few had died under suspicious circumstances that local authorities had been paid to ignore. By late August, Abby had assembled enough testimony to build a compelling case against Charles Ashford that went far beyond his attempts to reclaim his property in the Dakota Territory. The pattern of abuse was clear, documented in medical records, witness statements, and legal documents that painted a picture of a man who used wealth and influence to destroy anyone who crossed him. But gathering evidence was only the first step. Getting it into the hands of officials who couldn't be bought or intimidated was proving more difficult. Ashford's network of corruption seemed to extend everywhere, and every time they thought they'd found an honest path to justice, another doors slammed shut. It was Captain Hayes who finally provided the breakthrough they needed. His superior, Colonel Marcus Thompson, was a Civil War veteran like Sam who'd built his reputation on integrity and competence rather than political connections. More importantly, Thompson was personally incorruptible. He'd turned down bribes from railroad companies, mining interests, and political machines for his entire career. The colonel's been looking for a way to clean up the territorial administration, Hayes told Sam during a clandestine meeting at a trading post halfway between the fort and Sam's Valley. He's got federal authority to investigate corruption in territorial government, and he's been waiting for the right case to make an example. Will he listen to testimony from women who've been afraid to speak out before? He'll listen to anyone who can provide evidence of federal crimes. And if what you're telling me is true, Ashford's use of fraudulent federal documents to harass your family constitutes exactly that kind of crime. Colonel Thompson proved to be everything Captain Hayes had promised us, a career soldier who valued truth over politics and justice over expediency. When presented with the evidence Abby had gathered, his reaction was swift and decisive. "This man is a cancer on the body politic," Thompson declared after reviewing the testimonies and documents. "If we allow wealthy criminals to use the federal government as their personal enforcement agency, we might as well auction off the Constitution to the highest bidder." Within days, federal marshals were serving real warrants on Charles Ashford's associates, freezing bank accounts used to fund the harassment campaign, and arresting territorial officials who'd been taking bribes. The fake railroad company dissolved overnight when its investors realized they'd been funding a criminal conspiracy rather than a legitimate business venture. But Ashford himself, even from his prison cell, managed one last desperate attempt to destroy the family that had defied him. Using contacts in the criminal underworld that his legitimate business had carefully cultivated, he arranged for a final assault on Sam's Valley, not by hired gunmen this time, but by something far more devastating. On a clear September morning, as the first hints of autumn were beginning to touch the cottonwood trees along the creek, smoke began rising from the southern end of their valley. Someone had set fire to the grassland during the driest part of the year, creating a wildfire that would sweep across their homestead like a tide of destruction. Sam saw the smoke first, while checking his trap lines near the head of the valley. The wind was from the south, pushing the fire directly toward their cabin, their crops, and everything they'd built together over the past months. He had maybe 2 hours before the flames reached their home, And in that time, he had to save not just their lives but their future. Racing back to the cabin, Sam found Abby already organizing the children to gather their most precious possessions. She'd seen frontier fires before during their journey west, and she understood as well as Sam did that they were facing a fight for survival that would make their previous battles seem simple by comparison. "The creek," Sam said as he burst through the cabin door. "We need to get everything we can't afford to lose to the creek. The fire won't cross running water, but everything else is going to burn." As the family worked frantically to save what they could from the approaching inferno, Sam Rivers realized that Charles Ashford had found the one weapon that could truly destroy them, the very land they'd learned to love. But he'd underestimated the strength of the bonds that had been forged in this valley, and the determination of people who'd already lost everything once, and refused to lose it again. The wildfire roared through the southern end of their valley, like a living demon, consuming everything in its path with an appetite that seemed almost personal. Sam Rivers had seen prairie fires before, but nothing like this. The flames reached 30 feet into the air, driven by winds that seemed to shift direction just to cause maximum destruction. This wasn't a natural disaster. This was warfare, waged with the elements themselves. Working with desperate efficiency, the family loaded their most precious possessions onto a hastily built raft that Sam pushed into the middle of the creek. Abby's legal documents went first. Wrapped in oiled cloth, they represented not just her freedom, but evidence of Charles Ashford's crimes that had taken months to gather. The children's few treasured belongings followed, along with Sam's trapping, tools and the small amount of money they'd saved for winter supplies. "The horses!" Jacob shouted over the growing roar of the approaching flames. Copper and Moses were terrified, their eyes rolling white as the smell of smoke filled their nostrils. Sam made the hardest decision of his life. He threw open the corral gate and slapped both animals on the rump, sending them galloping toward the northern end of the valley where the creek widened into a natural fire break. "They know where the maid safe ground is," he told Jacob, seeing the boy's anguished face. "Animals are smarter about fire than people are." The flames reached their homestead just as the family took refuge in the creek itself, standing waist-deep in the cold water while their world burned around them. The cabin they'd expanded with such care disappeared in minutes, consumed by flames. That turned their carefully chinked logs into an inferno. The garden where Abby had taught Hannah to grow vegetables was reduced to ash. The chicken coop Sam had built became a pyre that sent sparks spinning into the darkening sky. But they were alive, standing together in the creek, holding onto each other as the fire raged past them. The Rivers family endured Charles Ashford's final attempt to destroy them. The flames consumed their possessions, but couldn't touch the bonds that held them together, couldn't burn away the love that had grown from shared hardship and mutual protection. When the fire finally passed, leaving behind a blackened wasteland where their green valley had been, Sam thought they'd lost everything. The cabin was gone, their crops were destroyed, and the landscape looked like something from a fever dream. Charred trees reaching toward the sky like skeletal fingers, ash drifting in the wind like gray snow. But as they picked through the ruins of their home, something extraordinary happened. Hannah, who'd been digging through the debris where her mother's herb garden had been, let out a shout of excitement that brought the whole family running. "Look," she cried, holding up a handful of what looked like ordinary rocks. "They're shiny." Sam took the stones from her small hands and felt his heart skip a beat. These weren't ordinary rocks, they were pieces of raw silver ore, exposed by the fire's heat and melted from a vein that had run directly under their cabin foundation. The very place where they'd built their home sat on top of a silver deposit that could make them wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. That's why Ashford was so determined to get this land, Abby breathed, understanding immediately. He knew. Somehow he knew there was silver here. Sam turned one of the ore samples over in his hands, watching how it caught the morning light. Graves mentioned mineral rights. I thought he was just making up stories to justify the fake railroad claims. Jacob, always practical despite his young age, asked the question that would determine their future. What do we do now? News of the silver discovery, combined with evidence that Charles Ashford had attempted to murder a family by arson in order to steal their mineral rights, provided federal authorities with everything they needed to destroy the railroad baron's empire completely. Colonel Thompson's investigation expanded into a full-scale federal prosecution that reached from Chicago to Washington, D.C., exposing a network of corruption that had operated for years. Charles Ashford himself was transferred from territorial prison to federal custody, facing charges that would keep him behind bars for the rest of his life. His business empire was dismantled, his assets seized to pay restitution to his victims, and his political allies distanced themselves as quickly as possible from the scandal. But perhaps the most satisfying justice came from an unexpected source. Edmund Graves, the fake surveyor who'd started the whole final confrontation, turned out to be a man with a conscience after all. Horrified by the realization that his lies had nearly resulted in the murder of children, he provided federal prosecutors with detailed testimony about Ashford's criminal organization. "I thought I was just helping a rich man reclaim his property," Graves confessed to Sam when he returned to the valley to testify before the federal grand jury. "I never imagined he'd try to burn you out. When I saw what the fire had done, I knew I had to make things right." The silver discovery transformed the Rivers family from struggling homesteaders into wealthy landowners. But wealth couldn't rebuild their home or restore their burned valley overnight. They spent the autumn living in a temporary shelter, Sam, built from salvaged materials, working to prepare for winter while making plans for a future that suddenly held unlimited possibilities. The new cabin they designed was larger than the old one, built with proper stone foundations and a layout that would accommodate their growing family. Because that's what they were now, a real family in every sense that mattered. Sam had formally proposed to Abby on a crisp October morning, as they stood looking at the first green shoots pushing up through the ash-covered soil, and she'd accepted with tears of joy streaming down her face. "I love you," she'd told him simply. "Not because you saved us, not because you protected us, but because you saw us as people worth saving in the first place." Their wedding was held in a rebuilt cabin on a snowy December day, with Captain Hayes officiating and half the population of Fort Dakota in attendance. Jacob and Hannah served as witnesses, their faces glowing with happiness as they watched their mother marry the man who'd become their father in everything but blood. 5 years later, the Rivers silver mine had become one of the most productive operations in the Dakota Territory, providing employment for dozens of families and helping to build the town of Morgan's Creek, named for Abby's chosen identity as a free woman. The mine's profits had funded schools, churches, and businesses that transformed the isolated valley into a thriving community. But Sam and Abby never forgot where they'd come from or how easily fortune could change. They used their wealth to help other women escape abusive situations, funding a network of safe houses and legal advocates had extended across the frontier. The Morgan Foundation, as it came to be known, provided assistance to anyone fleeing domestic violence, offering not just shelter but the resources needed to build new lives. Jacob grew into a confident young man who understood both the value of hard work and the importance of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. He planned to study law, inspired by his family's experiences with both corrupt and honest legal systems. Hannah became the town's first teacher, her natural empathy and intelligence making her beloved by children and parents alike. On a warm summer evening, as Sam sat on the porch of their grand new house watching his wife teach reading to a group of neighborhood children, he reflected on the strange journey that had brought them all together. A chance blizzard had thrown 3 desperate people into his isolated world, and in saving them, he discovered that he was the one who truly needed rescuing. The truth that Abby had been hiding wasn't just her identity or her past. It was her capacity for love, forgiveness, and healing. She'd hidden it so deep that she'd almost forgotten it herself, buried under years of abuse and fear. But in the safety of Sam's Valley, surrounded by honest affection and genuine protection, that truth had emerged like silver ore exposed by fire. Charles Ashford had spent his fortune and destroyed his empire trying to reclaim what he thought belonged to him. But he'd never understood that people aren't property, that love can't be owned, and that the strongest chains are the ones we choose to wear. His obsession with control had ultimately freed his victims to build something he could never touch, a family bound together by choice rather than coercion. The silver mine that had made them rich was just a bonus, a gift from the earth that had sheltered them through their darkest hours. The real treasure had been there all along in the courage of a woman who'd risked everything to protect her children, in the love of kids who'd refused to give up hope, and in the heart of a lonely man who'd rediscovered his capacity for caring. As the sun set over the thriving community that had grown up around their mine, Sam Rivers understood that some storms bring destruction, but others bring exactly what you need when you need it most. The blizzard that had nearly killed Abby and her children had actually saved them all, washing away their old lives and giving them the chance to build something better from the ashes. The Dakota territory was still a hard land that demanded everything from those who chose to make it home. But for the Rivers family, it had become something more, a place where truth could emerge from hiding, where love could triumph over control, and where three strangers could become the foundation of a legacy that would endure for generations. In the end, that was the secret Abby had carried through the blizzard, not just her own capacity for survival, but her family's ability to transform suffering into strength, fear into courage, and desperate flight into the foundation of a home that no amount of wealth or power could ever take away.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.